Poetry Center, bringing poetry to Paterson since 1980 at Passaic County Community College.
Our next speaker is Danny Schott, and Danny is one of the editors and the founder of Long Shot magazine. And as Elliot Katz mentioned before, Alan helped to get that magazine started by helping with finances, and he was always extremely generous about giving new poems for publication in the magazine. And as an editor myself, I have to say, he was always very generous with us as well in giving us poems. So I'd like you to welcome Danny Schott, the editor of Long Shot magazine.
Thank you, Maria. Andy was talking before about the famous people Alan introduced him to. And when I think back about Alan, perhaps what comes to mind most is not the famous people, but the friends that I have met through him, and the admiration and respect that we all shared for him. And that seems to be a common string or theme in our friendship. The funeral started at 9, and I couldn't get there until 10:30 at the earliest. My buddies Elliot and Andy doubted I'd get in because the funeral was supposed to be for Ginsy's very closest friends and family, but the Post and Daily News had printed the address of where the service was to be held. I figured if I didn't get in, so be it. I'd stand outside with all the other grieving souls. It was at the Shambhala Center on 22nd Street and was to be a Buddhist service. I had no idea what to expect. Why was I going to Allen Ginsberg's funeral? Because he was a friend, simple as that. He had been a friend for 20 years, definitely not the most exciting 20 years of his life, but 20 years that were virtually my entire adult life. Elliot Katz and I first met Allen in the fall of 1976. Of course, I'd heard of Allen Ginsberg before that. I'd seen him on the TV news, chanting, marching, dancing, playing his strange black harmonium, exclaiming his poetry at various demonstrations, be-ins, and happenings throughout my childhood in the 60s. In the 6th grade, I put a poster of him up in my room, not for any literary significance, because he looked so cool and so strange with all that hair coming out of the stars and stripes of his Uncle Sam hat. I read about him in Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which was like my Bible during my high school druggie days. As a matter of fact, I still have the book. Here's what Wolfe wrote about Ginsberg's encounter with the Hells Angels. Quote, Ginsberg really bowled the angels over. He was a lot of things the angels hated. A Jew, an intellectual, a New Yorker, but he was too much. He was the greatest, straightest, unstraight guy they ever met. Page 154 for all the academics. I read the poem Howl during my freshman year of college. Howl was a poem that did what no other poem could do. It spoke to me directly from the page. No interpreters were needed. In a matter of months, I was transformed from a biology major, future doctor of America, to a black-clad, too much attitude for so small a frame English major who wanted to someday be a famous writer. Also, during our freshman year at Rutgers, Elliot and I took an English class called The Beat Tradition in American Literature. It was taught by the most popular teaching assistant at the school, Bob Campbell, or Beat Bob Campbell as he was sometimes known. This class was like no other class I ever had taken. Each class session, a different student would bring in a jug of wine for us to share as we debated the finer points of the Beat generation. After a few weeks of wine-fueled discussions, someone lit up a joint, and from that moment on, pot smoking became an added stimulant to our daily discussions. We would stuff our denim jackets under the doors so that the smoke would not waft into the hallway and the other classrooms. It was during these heady days of our Beat Trad class that I decided to embark on the career path of becoming a beatnik poet. One fall day of our sophomore year, Elliot and I were drinking beer on the front steps of our new apartment, dumbly watching the Puerto Rican kids play kickball on the street. A black taxi pulled up in front of our house. A bald, bearded, slightly stooped man got out and began unloading boxes from the cab. It was Ginsberg. We got off our asses and helped Allen Ginsberg carry the boxes, which were filled with copies of his father's book of poems, to the house across the street, which was the home of Kevin Hayes. Kevin was about 5 years older than us and the only real poet we knew. He was also president of the Rutgers Gay Alliance, the group that was sponsoring Allen Ginsberg's poetry reading that night. We unloaded the box and promised Allen and Kevin we would see the reading that night. The poetry reading was more like a concert than a literary event. Ginsberg had a rock star aura about him, drawing the audience to his words, making the audience of about 500 people feel as if he were addressing each person individually. When it was over, people lit matches and lighters, and the star poet recited an encore and then another. After the encores were finished, I waited in line to talk to Allen Ginsberg and to give him a poem I had written that was inspired by his poem, America. My masterpiece was entitled America 1976, and it was a god-awful mishmash of teen angst, unrequited love, faux street wisdom, drug-induced paranoia, and recycled Kiss lyrics. Ginsberg looked at the poem for about 30 seconds and said, "The problem with this," I cut him off. "Allen," I said, "put it away and read my poem when you have the time, then write me and tell me what you think. My address is on the back." What can I say? I was young, brash, and stupid. Elliot and I drove Allen back to his apartment in the city that night in Elliot's orange Chevy Vega, I guess because nobody else had a car, and maybe because he liked the idea of being driven home by two 19-year-old boys. We received a free guided tour of the East Village with Allen merrily playing tour guide and pointing out the historical significance of such non-sites as the Gem Spa, the Holiday Cocktail Lounge, and the apartment where Leon Trotsky lived before he went off to Mexico to meet his fate. We helped him carry his boxes of books up the flight of stairs to his apartment on East 12th Street. Allen asked us to sit down and join him for a cup of tea. I visually took in the landscape of his apartment, thinking, so this is what the life of a poet looks like. About 10 days after our meeting, I received a postcard. It's packed away in a box now, but it said something like this, quote, "To prevent falling into the dumb, single-minded trap you fall into, you must be mindful that each line should ring with poetry, imagery, panoramic vision, wordplay. As New Jersey bard William Carlos Williams states, no ideas but in things. Your poem has moments. Perhaps it could make a good haiku. With love, A. Ginsberg." At first I was hurt, then I was angry, but when I thought about it, I was honored that a world-famous poet and beatnik would take the time out of his schedule to spend on me. Over the years, Allen Ginsberg and I maintained a friendship that has had its ups and downs, but lasted. Because of him and with him, I read my poetry to larger crowds than I ever again could hope to draw. Allen once did a reading with Elliot and I at the Rutgers Student Center where he split the door with us 50-50, which was enough money for us to start our own magazine, which we titled Longshot. Allen had been a frequent contributor to our magazine, giving us previously unpublished poems and photos and never asking for anything in return. Many of the friends I have today are friends I met because of Allen Ginsberg. The poems I've written often have Mr. Ginsberg in mind as the audience, whether to impress him or defy him. Some poet once said, when a man dies, a universe dies with him. He probably meant that each person has an almost infinite amount of associations and memories and feelings and thoughts within him or herself, and when that person ceases to be alive, those connections are lost. Allen Ginsberg's death must have left a sizable hole in the universe. The last time I saw Allen was about 3 months ago at a memorial reading for Herbert Huncke. After the reading, Allen and I were going to share a cab to the Port Authority, he to catch a bus to Paterson to visit his stepmother, and me to catch a bus home to Hoboken. Elliot offered to drive Allen to the Port Authority and me home. We had a laughter-filled drive across at the expense of a mutual friend who had asked Allen if he'd listened to the compilation he produced of golf songs. Allen didn't understand the concept. Songs about golf? We spent the ride goofing on possible golf songs such as I'm Your Bogey Man, Get Down and Bogey, Take This Club and Shove It, and Putt Putt Puttin' on Heaven's Door. Somehow the conversation got around to death. When my time comes, Allen said, I want my body to lie in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I want all the lovers I've ever had who are still around to file past my coffin. Hello, Allen, I said. First of all, you're a Jew, and second of all, you're a homosexual. Cardinal O'Connor's not going to let you have a funeral in his cathedral. He looked thoughtful for a minute. Maybe then St. John the Divine. They're pretty liberal. We laughed. Of course, the funeral is packed. Over 500 people sitting on square red and yellow cushions listening to Buddhist monks chant. For his family and for all the Jews, the mourner's Kaddish. 500 of Allen's closest friends in New York. People whose lives he touched in friendship. People who have stories to tell. There's Peter Orlovsky. There's Allen's 95-year-old stepmother. There's his brother Eugene. There's Amiri and Amina Baraka. There's Gregory Corso. There's Hetty Jones, Patti Smith, Ann Waldman, Lou Reed, Natalie Merchant, Philip Glass, Laurie Anderson, David Greenberg, Herschel Silverman, Andy Clausen, Elliot Katz, and me. Thank you.
Okay, are you sure some of you people who've been standing up for 2 hours would not like to find a little spot and just sit down on the floor? Surely we'll provide a crane to pick you up if you're afraid you won't be able to get up. Well, it's up to you. All right. The next person who will speak is Herschel Silverman, and Herschel Silverman is very much associated with New Jersey and with a very long correspondence that he had with Allen Ginsberg. Let's welcome Herschel Silverman.
Thanks, Maria. I just got word from my Japanese editor that like 100 poets in Japan are getting together for a memorial in Tokyo for Allen. I'll read an anecdote and a poem. May 5th, 1979 was William Carlos Williams Day in Paterson at the Rogers Locomotive Works building near the Great Falls. This day, Allen Ginsberg, a native Paterson poet, is being honored. The event is sponsored by the Great Falls Development Corp and held in a huge building where the old locomotives were built. The poetry event was held upstairs in a huge hall. Hundreds of people, many poets reading their poems to warm applause from the audience. An all-day affair. I met Allen Ginsberg and Ann Waldman there, and Edith Ginsberg, Eugene Brooks and Bob Rosenthal. We all toured the Great Falls and read poetry and had lunch in a diner across from the Locomotive Works. One of the most powerful poems I've heard Allen read, he read that afternoon, called the Plutonian Ode. That evening, after supper at Edith's home in Elmwood Park, Allen and myself were driven to Bayonne by a friend, Tommy Wanko. We drove through Bayonne on my way, and on the way to Tommy's house, we passed St. Henry's Church, which Allen commented on his beauty. In Tommy's house, Allen sat down at the piano and played a simple melody and sang Blake's Tiger, Tiger. We drove over to the high school and went behind the buildings to visit Newark Bay from off the Bayonne shoreline. It had just turned dark and the water sparkled, as did the distant lights across the bay in Port Newark and on the bridges. Again, Allen commented on the beauty of the setting. What a wonderful place to build a high school. We stopped at my candy store across from the high school complex. There were several bundles of Star Ledger Advanced Sunday sections in front of the store. Allen helped carry them inside. He displayed a great deal of physical strength, 2 packs at a time, lifting the papers over the stools onto the counter. Most people weren't able to lift those bundles so high, and there was Allen. Who would think of it? You know, there he was, pitching in. There was a smell of mint and chocolate as we opened the door. Inside, Allen's natural curiosity led him around the counter to sniff and look into the candy counter, holding a large variety of candy bars. Allen asked while half kneeling behind the counter, "What is your largest selling candy bar?" I answered after a moment's hesitation, "Milky Way." And Allen sampled one. I made him a giant chocolate egg cream. He looked over the many pictures of Bayonne people I had pasted over the walls. We went to the back of the store where I stocked things not in daily use, and I gave Allen some Coca-Cola glasses for his own use. While in my store, Allen picked up a copy of Rolling Stone May 15th issue from off the magazine rack and opened it to pages 56 and 57, where is a full-page illustration of what appears to be a nuclear device on one page, and on the opposite page there is printed Allen's Plutonian Ode, which he had just read that afternoon in Paterson. Allen inscribed around the borders of that magazine, all around him, Allen inscribed, "For Herschel Silverman in Bayonne, Beehive Candy Store, Bayonne, at last visiting May 5th, 1979, William Carlos Williams Day at a Rogers Locomotive Factory near the Passaic Falls, and returning to New York via the candy store." We then drove off with Tommy Wanko to Allen's apartment on New York's East Side. This visit was the culmination of more than a 20 years wait. I had invited Allen to come over to Bayonne when he first arrived in the East on the way to Europe, and wrote that he would try to visit, and hungry, drink the malts of hospitality in my store, and mention his book of poems which I might like and could be purchased by mail from City Lights Bookstore, San Francisco, 261 Columbus Avenue. I later found the book. It's sort of an, quote, It's sort of on a Jimmy Dean youth kick, Allen wrote in a New York bookstore. The book was How, one of the turning points of modern American literature. How humble was Allen's description. Now I have a poem. It's a play on Allen's initials, A.G., called American Guru. A.G., avant-garde, American Guru. Ah, poet is mid-century priest come through the silence of the ruling class. Poet's essence celebrates life on this planet with compassion, sums up wholeness from body parts, from within self, expresses with ultimate sincerity the wonder of self, speaks, does with candor, is poet maker of particular truths, rings freedom's bell with a prophet's voice. He jumped off the superstition like Columbus, taught good as a naked, mad scholar, free fool, poet, snatched truth from society quicksand, related the truth of trampled souls, of minds disconnected from reality. A.G., avant-garde, American Guru. Ah, being son of lyric teacher, poet, son of mother who cared too deeply, being brother, uncle, stepson, lover, and friend, hooked on a joy and a pain of language, his eyes focused, kissing time in the night, lips pronouncing truth, speaking sweet politics, and not so sweet too. A.G., avant-garde, American Guru, saw him, heard him in cafes, halls, great universities, confessing hysterical, hair disheveled, Hasidic, bearded, top of dumb, balded, brain seeming to push through skull, 1960s, to burst upon world a bomb of kindness, his eyes analytical, tender his universe. A.G., avant-garde, American Guru, he saw all, understood all, so energized, went on and on and upstart expresser of giggly weed, teacher and celebrator of gut feelings human, insightful, misunderstood, scoffed at during this scuffling century because mind to mind goes so slowly, his soul burnt with flesh in transit, with anxieties, colored with hallucination. A.G., avant-garde, American Guru, overcome by filial therapy of old father time. He grappled, channeled, creeping as Yeats' creature's second coming to rendezvous in Newark, Boulder, Michigan. Guru arrived on or going to Satori, breathing harmonium truth in holy chant, a high priest of ecstatic goof, holding key to future in poet hand. A.G., avant-garde, American Guru, Allen Ginsberg, 6/3/26/4597. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Robert Fiscausi, who is the director of the Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College, and who taught with Allen for a number of years, and who also did a number of programs with Allen, who wanted to speak today about him. Let's welcome Robert Fiscausi.
Allen taught at Brooklyn College on and off between 1979 and 1986, and then he was there for the last 10 years. He was an enormous feature of our lives there. He left, I don't know how many students. We wondered whether he would really fit in when he first came. But it turned out that his whole career, his teaching as well as his writing, was predicated on the notion that has in fact guided Brooklyn College since the day it opened, that the children of the poor are as good, as brilliant, deserve as good an education as the children of the rich. His definitive masterpiece, Howl, begins with the revolutionary line, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. The best minds of his generation. Allen's teaching consisted of this. He treated you as if you belonged to that category. He treated your humble circumstance, your poverty, your stigma as its own thing. He did not use it to diminish you in his eyes. Allen taught the universal divinity of all living creatures, his students and his fellow poets included. This made living in the same century with him a stroke of good fortune. To read Howl when it and I were young was a privilege I shared with a large generation of my fellow United States of Americans. Ginsberg in that poem turned our stigmata into patents of nobility. After Howl, we no longer had to hide our gender irregularities, our family names, our bad luck. All these became part of his comic universe. His teaching was visionary. He had studied the principles of reaching into the larger and wider beings that we are. These were principles of breathing and chanting, of harmlessness and generosity, and universal sympathy with universal suffering. We thought of him as sometimes the reincarnation of Walt Whitman, and when he first came to Brooklyn, we wondered whether he hadn't turned into a celebrity guru who would recite formulas to our students and spend his energy elsewhere. But that's not what happened. The first time I saw him at the mailbox in the Department of English, I took him for his own father, a middle-aged academic poet in a three-piece gray suit, wearing glasses and going bald. He had on a white shirt and a tie. He looked like one of the long-suffering soldiers of the academic civil service, winding down a career that he would afterwards think of whenever he looked at his gold pocket watch. I never questioned Ginsberg about this uniform. I took it as his reassurance that he had not come to Brooklyn merely to receive his admirers, and in fact he worked hard from the beginning to the end. See and be radiant, one of our college mottos, might have been coined to describe his way of living and of teaching. And his teaching has worked. Ginsberg lived in a saintly manner, that is, he understood full well that his example would find imitators and that his prayers would have answers. If living in the same century with him was a privilege, then teaching in the same college with him, even in the same department, was an education. He was a complete professor in that he taught what he believed. Allen lived according to his principles, his generosity, kindness, concentration, brilliance, his openness to the virtues of others. All these virtues in him reached sky high. One could not spend an hour in his presence and not come away wishing oneself a better person, a more attentive teacher, a more devoted citizen of the Republic of Letters. He changed my life. I understood from watching him that I could easily act to improve the world if only I allowed myself to do so. His example taught me to think more seriously, more systematically of civics as part of a writer's training. Allen Ginsberg, like Walt Whitman before him, practiced citizenship at an intense level of visionary clarity. His achievement is to have invented whole new worlds for the democratic mind to inhabit, whole new sympathies for democratic ethics to explore. He believed in pleasure. He believed in delight. He cast away shame like an old cloak. I once heard him in the late 60s in the open-air amphitheater that divides Whitman Hall from Gershwin Hall at Brooklyn College. Standing before 2,000 people in the open air of high noon on the 1st of May, Allen Ginsberg took out his little concertina and sang "Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?" We always wondered where he had come from, how he had managed to ascend such heights so rapidly and to take us with him as he went. He was in flight all the time. He had just returned from Romania, from Hungary, from Italy. When he paused to say hello, he irradiated you with the serious eyes of a God whose time is growing short. Where has he gone now?
I hope he's here with us today and having a good time. The next speaker is George James. And George, I don't know how many of you remember references. As a person who grew up in Paterson, the Paterson Morning Call was the liberal paper, and the Paterson Herald News, which no longer actually exists as a paper, it has been absorbed into the Herald and News, was the more conservative paper. My father was an arch radical, used to have a fit. He would read both papers and he would end up screaming at the Herald News, and Harry Haynes, who was the editor of the Herald News, he always loved the Morning Call because he thought it was much more liberal, but not liberal enough for him. George James now writes for the New York Times, but he has wonderful articles that he has done over the past 20 years or so about Allen Ginsberg, about Paterson. Most recent article, an interview with Edith Ginsberg, which was really wonderful. And I'd like you to welcome George James, formerly of the Paterson Morning Call, and now of the New York Times.
I feel very honored, Maria, to be here, and I thank you. At a poetry reading at the Paterson YMHA, October 23rd, 1966, Allen Ginsberg told his audience he had visited the Passaic Falls, where we were this morning, had been impressed by their beauty, and had smoked marijuana to heighten the experience. Mayor Francis X. Graves, Jr., who was known for his unpredictability and his love of publicity, God bless him, read this in the paper and ordered a warrant issued for Allen Ginsberg's arrest. Allen returned to Paterson Municipal Court to answer the charges in February of 1967 because he wanted to read poetry with his father at Paterson, then Paterson State College, in March. The old municipal court was in the old police headquarters. It was off to the left of the entrance, and about 60 persons were in the small green room. It smelled of fresh paint. Fluorescent lights hanging from the high ceiling were barely enough to light the room. Large windows along one wall provided no light or open space because they faced the brick wall of a warehouse about 4 feet away. The parade in front of the bench consisted of persons charged with malicious mischief and drunkenness. Allen watched them very closely. His legs were crossed under the seat, and one shook nervously. Then, at about 9:40 a.m., his name was called, and he stood in front of the bench looking up at a cowboy-lanky judge named Irvan Kushner. At 40, Ginsberg was almost bald on top. Long black hair billowed out from the sides and rear of his head over the back of his white shirt and rumpled gray suit. His shaggy beard, speckled with gray, covered the knot of his necktie and the top of a woe-worn gray and white striped sweater. Electric blue socks showed between his gray buff three-quarter shoes and baggy pants. An Indian medallion hung from a chain around his neck. "What have I got here?" Judge Kushner asked the bailiff. An official read the charge. Did use a narcotic drug for purpose other than treatment for sickness, etc. Allen looked very uncomfortable as he leaned his arm on the judge's bench. Judge Irvan Kushner dismissed the charge, saying a public statement does not a confession make. And Allen left beaming, bowing before the judge with his hands in front of him as if he were praying or thanking him. Outside he came with his father, Louis, and friends, and to celebrate, they went to the donut kettle across the street for tea and donuts. I had a beard then, and that was a very rare thing in Paterson in 1967, and when he came out and he saw me, he said, "What are you, the local pothead?" And Louis invited me across the street to have a donut. Louis Ginsberg, beardless, impeccable in a checked sport jacket and black and gold tie, was telling someone with fatherly indignation, they had no proof except Alan's word, which was doubtful. Let us jump forward a little bit into the year 1997. We're in Edith Ginsberg's apartment in East Paterson. For the Ginsbergs, whose lives were disrupted by the mental disintegration of Naomi, wife and mother, chronicled by Ellen and Kaddish, the arrival of Edith into the household brought harmony and love and normalcy. To her, Alan was a stepson who grew to be like a son, chatting with her by phone once a week at midnight until the day he died. Depicted by Alan and Kaddish as tearful and lonely in his solitude, while Naomi ranted against him at home or in institutions, Louis Ginsberg showed up at Edith Cohen's door on Graham Avenue in Paterson one day in late 1946 or early 1947. He was already past 50, low-paid English teacher at Central High School in Paterson, who had been told by a mutual friend to seek her out. She was 40, a divorced woman with a teenage son and daughter whom she supported by traveling by bus to hospitals where she sold nurses' uniforms manufactured by her father's small company. Tucked under his arm was a book of poetry, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, with his oft-quoted lines, a book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou, beside me, singing in the wilderness. He was in a suit and tie, she recalls, always wore a suit and tie. I can't ever remember seeing him in anything but a suit and tie. He came and he said, Esther Cohen has told me that we might be friends. And I said, open the gate, and I invited him in, and we talked, and we danced. He was a good dancer. Let us go back to 1967. Alan was saying in the donut kettle, the furor over there are two ways of looking at this, as a little scandalous, or as a family occasion at which my father and I were making an exemplary statement to this community. Alan said he and his father, representing different generations and thought, can still get together even though there is misunderstanding between the generations today. For the city to have interfered is a very poor show, said Alan. You can see our gathering as discordant or harmonious. Their heads were filled with discord, and they didn't see the harmony of the situation. We are the only father and son poets in America, said Louis Ginsberg. He said it with pride, even though he and Alan have very different ways of life. In the late 60s, father and son began doing poetry readings together. The elder Ginsberg in his bow tie, a man from another more genteel age playing on words as was his way. Not every beard is a bard, but with Alan it grows on you. And his hirsute son, reading his verse, chanting it, shaking his head from side to side like a happy elephant. All I know is I drove them around to the poetry readings, Mrs. Ginsberg says. I was the driver in the family, and it certainly did change my life. It changed my style of living. It made a different person out of me. I met different people. I knew different people. I wasn't as reserved.